Afternoon, glad you're with us this afternoon. Well, it now appears the ANC is trying to, as they call it, engage with their employees in government about whether or not the Russian President Vladimir Putin can be welcomed here if he comes for the BRICS summit in August. Currently, government has extended an invitation to him to come. But the International Criminal Court says that countries that have signed up to the ICC must arrest him if he sets foot on their soil. We are still a signatory to the International Criminal Court, despite the fact our government appeared to defy a court order that had arrested the then Sudanese leader Omar al-Bashir in 2015. I should maybe remind you that in human history, no serving head of state has ever been arrested or detained by another country. When in very ancient history it's happened, that's usually led to war. Sanusha Naidu is a political analyst. Sanusha, good afternoon to you. How difficult is this issue for government now?
Good afternoon, Stephen, and good afternoon to the viewers. I think it's absolutely an intricate, entangled dilemma for government because unlike the al-Bashir case, where it was very clear in terms of what the court had then decided in their judgment about the South African government applying the Rome Statute, the fact that the Rome Statute is embedded in our legal system in terms of a statute within Parliament. So to repeal this, on the one hand, last week, if you remember, Parliament, or was it the week before, Parliament did a bill to remove ourselves from the ICC was withdrawn. And that means that it's not just about withdrawing yourself from the ICC membership. You've also got to now look at the reservations around the Rome Statute and the domestication of the Rome Statute. So the complication in terms of where South Africa finds itself now is an added dilemma because it's not just about a head of state in terms of coming to South Africa based on the AU, because the AU then, I think, had asked South Africa at the time, and I stand corrected on this, to host the AU summit because the country was going to host for some reason or the other could not. This time around, South Africa is chairing the BRICS, and it's almost the context in which this is taking place. So when the invitation, and this is where we also have to be very clear, when the invitation was submitted to the Russian president to invite him to attend the BRICS summit, this is normal kind of procedure when it comes to hosting and chairing of international events and serving in terms of an event like the BRICS. So these things go out about 8-9 months before the actual summit will take place. They'll have to basically decide on availability of the dates for all the heads of state to come in and all of that. And so when that was done is the first question. And the second one is, does ICC now arrest warrant in terms of suspicion of what they are claiming that President Putin is involved in with regard to the human rights abuses against children and so forth? I think that also needs to be looked at in context. But I think the challenge for South Africa is it now has to think about how it actually separates the politics from the legal dynamic. And that's where I think later in the week, Parliament has to be very clear when they ask these questions to DIRCO and to any other government involved and the presidency involved in this summit, that they have to be clear about what is the politics and what is the legal instruments that you have to adhere to.
I mean, government, the ANC government may want to do one thing. The rest of the country, as we well know, Sanusha, may have other ideas. The International Relations Minister, Dr. Naledi Pandor, said on Friday that it's her understanding that if Putin came here, government would have to arrest him. That's based on the previous rulings. She's also the person issuing the invitation. So I think for her to say that is quite important.
Yeah, because you must remember, you are a member of the ICC and you've domesticated the Rome Statute. So irrespective of what you would like to do and how you actually interpret what has been some of the contradictions of the ICC and the way the ICC has been applied its mandate, that is something that you have to think about in terms of the fact that you are a signatory to it. You remember. So in the context of what the minister is saying is that on the basis of all of the criticisms that have been leveled against the ICC, the fact of the matter is that South Africa feels, as much as some other African countries and other African countries may feel, there's a disingenuous approach to the way the way the ICC applies itself. The fact of the matter is, as a signatory, you've got the obligation under legal norm and principles and standards of the international rules-based system to apply and implement the application and the arrest warrant. So those are two things I think is very interesting because, again, I go back to the point I made earlier. If you're thinking about when the invitation was issued and when the ICC issued its arrest warrant. It's going to be very interesting to find that, because it also now compels South Africa as a signatory to follow through in terms of its obligations under the ICC membership.
I mean, it's an important debate because it says so many different things about the rule of law, about government, about judges, about our relationship with the International Criminal Court. In real politics, Sanusha, I mean, Putin's not going to come, is he? I mean, he's not going to leave the Kremlin, surely, when his country's at war. I mean, if he were arrested here, he'd shoot his way out.
I don't think that we'll go that far in shooting his way out. I think what we've got to be very clear-headed about, Stephen, is his prerogative to choose to accept the invitation or choose to say, I can virtually be online. And that's something that I think what has happened when COVID-19 had been at its peak is that a lot of these summits had gone online. And I think with the BRICS heads of state, where once they had, probably for quorum, they had to basically have all 5 heads of state present in person. I think now my understanding is, again, I stand corrected, is that quorum can be made if 4 heads of state are in person and the 1 can be online. So you've got that little corridor in which you can maneuver yourself in. But I think what's also important is that at the same time, I'm not sure if this will give a renewed impetus for South Africa to review the ICC as well and its membership, because remember we spoke earlier about the removal of it came out of one of the resolutions from the ANC National Elected Conference. I'm not sure if it was this one or the previous one, that we have to basically think about our membership in the ICC. But of course that was withdrawn. But now I think we may have to think about how the ANC government may think about this in the context of where it plays into the context of realpolitik, but also in the context of what will be the kind of response we see in the week ahead in terms of this issue.
So my understanding of the International Criminal Court, and this is a fundamental thing in humanity, is that it exists particularly for places, for positions, and it's happened in many places around the world in human history, where a ruler is basically just not accountable to the law. That's the rationale behind it. And Bashir is a great example because he was accused of genocide. His own country wouldn't act against him, and so the International Criminal Court issued a warrant. And we can argue about whether or not Putin is guilty of war crimes, but the fact is they've issued the indictment. So I accept that, and I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah.
I wonder if maybe the International Criminal Court is just reaching too far, because if anyone were ever to arrest a sitting head of state, it would probably result in conflict. I mean, I can't see any way around that.
Yeah, I think it raises the dynamics of how the interpretation of the rule of law and the statute is applied in practice. So it's really the question of, if you take the basic principle as you interpret it in terms of what is the most original basic interpretation of what the ICC's mandate is, then of course we're entering into that corridor of uncertainty, because you have to think about heads of states that are not members of the ICC, that may have committed crimes against humanity, in terms of the fact that it's done in a way that perhaps either makes it very difficult to bring them to the ICC, but it also makes it difficult if they're not members of the ICC. And I think to a large extent that becomes the critical criteria in terms of application and implementation of the mandate you mentioned. So you're right in the one sense that it's also opening up for further instability and further conflict in terms of the rules-based system. That in some instances you can utilize the ICC in terms of what your political mandate wants to be, but also how you want to push that realpolitik further. On the other hand, you don't want to be part of the ICC, but then at the same time you want the ICC to run on that mandate. Let me give you a short example. Where's the evidence that comes to present at the ICC? So you've got to gather the evidence. Can a non-member of the ICC use evidence that they have to then bring to the ICC and say, here's the evidence that we want to use in order to indict and issue an arrest warrant for a particular head of state. And I think that's an interesting dimension to look at, because then what it does is it opens up the country that's not a member to other scrutiny and issues around how do you then apply that to others. So I think what was interesting as well, you talk about the al-Bashir case, but I think you had the other case in terms of Kenya, where you had William Ruto and Kenyatta, both actually based on based on evidence brought or a case brought to the ICC on their role in the political violence in the run-up to the election that saw Kenyatta become president. And then, of course, it was withdrawn. So you kind of have that avenue as well to think about in what is it that you actually apply in the rule of law in terms of the interpretation of the mandate, and how does it not become politicized in the context of real politics.
In all of this, I don't know if I know where most South Africans are on this issue, because the accusation is that the ANC government is pro-Russia. I'm oversimplifying that. That's sort of true, as so many things are. But the point is that, the sort of accusation is that by being non-aligned, you're not actually taking a stance on a moral issue. For example, you could contrast that with the ANC's very strong denunciation of Israel's conduct against Palestinians, against the U.S. invasion of Iraq. At the same time, though, I've seen one public poll from a pro-West organization, The Economist, that seems to suggest most South Africans don't really agree with government stance, but I don't know if that's true.
It's a difficult one to assess because you're trying to gauge public sentiment based on how people are responding to perhaps editorials. I've seen a lot of editorials about South Africa needing to do what it needs to do in terms of its legal obligation, and that it's almost as if Putin is already agreed to come, and so this is what your mandate should be. So I think that's the one area. But I think you're right. I think it definitely requires a testing of the public opinion around, is this an issue that South Africans are seized with across the board, whether we're talking about people in leafy suburbs, whether we're talking about people who actually subscribe to the idea that the international system is an equitable, just and fair place. What is it that basically occupies the minds of ordinary South Africans when it comes to foreign policy? And there was a survey done when I was with the Open Society Foundation about these kinds of issues, is what really are the key issues that basically ordinary South Africans want to see in the foreign policy space. And this was one of the questions, really, in terms of that. And people actually talked about trade, investment. They talked about how much we need to be much more part of the international system, but also bring the investment in for employment purposes. I suspect, several years later, we're going to see shifts in those perceptions. But again, the perception is how much does it seize ordinary South Africans, or is it a conversation that's happening in particular spaces within particular constructs of society?
Thank you very much indeed, Sanusha Naidu, political analyst. Really appreciate the time. We could go on forever, and one day we probably will. Really appreciate it.